Welcome to The Empowerment Show, a podcast designed to empower women like you to take control of your lives, make informed decisions, and redefine success on your own terms, beyond the noise of influencer culture.
All right. Well, hello. Welcome back. I'm Adama. I am here, as always, with my fabulous co-hosts, Maddie and Sam. And we are thrilled to bring you the second part of our conversation with Ambassador Demetrius Marantis. If you have not yet, please make sure that you check out our first episode where we talked about trade, tariffs, and how that all affects you and your wallet. Demetrius, as you might have guessed from his title, is a diplomat as well as an expert on international relations and trade. Demetrius has worked on high-profile trade agreements during his time with the U.S. Senate Committee on Finance and in the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative. And as the acting U.S. Trade Representative, he traveled the globe as a diplomat for the United States. And from this, he's got a really unique perspective on international relations. And he's here with us today to talk about how even though international conflict might feel very far away, it's still shaping your gas bill, your safety, and your voice, and the people who represent you in Congress. So, Demetrius, thank you again for being here.
I'm thrilled to be back.
Awesome. Well, we are going to get into this. And one of the things that, is of particular interest to us is that, women are often left out of these foreign policy conversations, even though we do tend to be affected by some of the direct and just kind of the ripple effects, the economy, displacement, violence, things like that. Looking at Ukraine, Gaza, Iran, there are three kind of places, global flashpoints with a lot of global repercussions. So can you kind of talk a little bit about how you navigated while you're at USTR, that kind of balance between diplomacy and trade, right? Those things have very, very correlating effects. And can you talk a little bit about that? And then also kind of how you saw it when you were in the private sector?
Look, I think picking up a little bit on some of the themes we talked about in our last episode, I think one of the key roles of a diplomat, a trade negotiator, whoever, is to help provide certainty. You want to have certainty in international relations. You want to have certainty in trade relations. Why? Because you need predictability in order to invest. You need predictability in order to do business. You need predictability in order to kind of figure out how to navigate the world. And we're in such a different place now than we were. I think we got very spoiled over the years of relative geopolitical calm, relative geopolitical certainty. We're now in a world where that just doesn't exist anymore. And it's very dangerous because you don't have the guardrails that kind of guarded the world for 50 plus 60 years really seem to have just evaporated. And it makes the job of a diplomat, a trade negotiator, or whoever all the more challenging because the rules of the road no longer really exist.
Right. What kind of has surprised you about that? Because it does seem to be like we are just in a very new period all of a sudden, right? How has this happened? Because I know kind of in the first administration, the first Trump administration, there was a lot of conversation about NATO and maybe it's outlived its usefulness. And it feels like maybe even Europeans might kind of be thinking it's time to retrench and, reestablish new allies, new kind of axes of power. What does this look like to you, this kind of changing landscape?
I think this has been coming. It didn't just happen because of President Trump. I think we've been in a world where the rules of the road that were established after World War II no longer seemed to reflect the world that we live in. And I think for the United States, we got, complacent because we kind of called the shots for 60 years. And in the past 20, you've had the rise, and it's a good thing. Countries have gotten more wealthy because of trade, and you have lots of different, countries that didn't have as much of a voice having a larger voice now, whether it's China, whether it's India, whether it's Brazil, whether it's South Africa, whether it's Indonesia, name it. There've been the resurgence of more powerful countries in the world that challenge the hegemony of the United States. And I think we're in a period right now of adjusting to the realities of today's world that are very different from when we were children or when our parents were children. And we're suffering, we're in the not even the teenage years, we're in like major growing pains right now. And everyone is kind of like lashing out. China's lashing out. We're lashing out. Russia's lashing out. And as a result, we're in a world of very unpredictable teenagers who can't really control themselves. And until they figure out how to establish their own internal guardrails, we're going to be in an era of, I think, significant geopolitical uncertainty.
I read a meme the other day on social media about how if only we weren't run by men who have severe daddy issues. And yeah, the teenage behavior, I think, is symptomatic of some deep-rooted problems.
So on top of that, you have a scenario where the U.S. has been relatively consistent in its behavior for so long, and now we are behaving in such a different way. We have kind of this tech bro move fast, break things mentality. And when you break things, you do have to fix them. And I think we're dealing with a different landscape at a time where we're upending all of our traditional systems as well.
Yeah. And that goes, Sam, I agree with you 100%. And that goes, Adama, to your point about like how the Europeans are assessing the U.S.'s security role in Europe in light of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, in light of, the need to make sure the European continent doesn't like revert back to the battle days, of pre-World War II. And the United States was the security commitment to the European continent for so many years. And with what has been coming out of the White House and sort of the attitudinal change, Europeans are having to reassess, and think, okay, we need to bear more of the burden for ourselves. And that's probably a good thing all around because, the United States can't be the security blanket of last resort, forever. And at the same time, Europe is recognizing that it needs to be more, sort of more responsible for its own, for the security of its own continent. So that's not the worst thing in the world, but it's a change.
Mm-hmm. Definitely is. So love to talk a little bit more about the role of women and just, I think one of the things that's been disappointing, to me just personally, for nothing else, I thought we might have a female president, a Black female president. I was super excited about that. And kind of some of the rhetoric that came out of the election was really disappointing to me. And it feels like we've seen enough women in power, even in the US. And we've seen, women even like Margaret Thatcher, who had no problems, being an aggressor on the international stage. But we've seen women leading all over the place. And we still have to hear that women are, not really suited for it, or maybe they're too emotional, or, they're bleeding everywhere, or like all of just the crazy rhetoric that came out of it. And that was incredibly disappointing to me. But we do have women who are in very high level positions, all around the world right now. And it's encouraging, but can you kind of maybe help us deconstruct kind of the gatekeeping of global affairs? And, I still remember, I am old enough to remember Hillary Clinton talking at the UN and saying human rights are female, women's rights are human rights, right? And it feels like we have moved backwards from that in many ways. And just even some of the things like we were talking about in the last episode, how trade can be incredibly empowering for women in different places around the world. So can you talk to us just a little bit about some of the global conflict that's going on? Things like Russia and Ukraine, things like Israel and Gaza, what is going on with Iran right now and the US. I personally think that we wouldn't have half these issues if women were running things. I could be wrong, but love to hear just kind of from your perspective, what is going on? Like for our listeners, high level, Russia, Ukraine, why is Russia just hell-bent on getting that back, you know?
Dama, I wanted, before talking about that, I think you brought up a really good point, which is what is the role of women in foreign policy and as in leadership roles. I think you're absolutely right that we're in an era right now of retrenchment. And you think of like women like, Margaret Thatcher or Madeleine Albright or Hillary Clinton. I remember actually you told me this once when we were working together. People need to see people like them at the top in order to encourage the next generation of those leaders. And we have to constantly remind ourselves of how successful Hillary Clinton was as in her role as Secretary of State. Right. I worked for President Obama when Secretary Clinton was Secretary of State. She blew me away. I mean, I was so incredibly in awe of her ability to negotiate with so many different foreign governments successfully on behalf of the United States. We have to just keep remembering these incredible women to empower the next generation. Because if we just kind of talk about them as if they were, in the past, you're not going to have a little girl who's in fifth grade today saying, I want to be Secretary of State when I grow up, or I want to be President of the United States when I grow up. So I think that's a very important point. And it's something I know that is like an important theme for this podcast, but it's an important theme for all of us, thinking about the next generation or this generation even. But anyway, that was a digression from what you had.
Oh, thank you.
No,
thank you.
It's so important because I think in the case of Clinton in particular, there's been, a really significant effort to either erase or defame all of that work. So it's even more important to elevate it to people who may not have been old enough to see it when it was happening.
And I don't even want to focus on the fact that Hillary Clinton, because we're all Democrats here. I mean, Condoleezza Rice was an unbelievable Secretary of State.
Absolutely.
She had a hard job. She's still like a very influential and, a role model for so many. I mean, we have women of all political stripes who we need to remember and, constantly remind today's or the upcoming generation that you can be that too.
Condoleezza Rice was one of the first women that Black woman who was like a specialist on Russia. She spoke Russian. She had studied Russia extensively. I mean, she was, a product of the Cold War era, but the expertise that she had on a country that was like so far away in my mind, as a young person, that there was this Black woman in the White House appointed by George Bush who was an expert on Russia. Like that was so eye-opening to me. I mean, Angela Merkel, hearing her speak Russian, and sit down and speak to Putin, and people were like, oh, but she's German. She grew up in East Germany, which was Russia. I do think, Sam, you're so right. And Demetrius, you're so right. We need to talk more about these things because they were incredibly formative to me, who's almost 50, but young women who are 20 and 25, they don't see those things. They don't, they're not on the news every night.
Or even 30, like me. Like, I mean, I started out my political career in politics. And as you both know, because Demetrius and Adamo are both my bosses, Demetrius was like our boss. But yeah. And, I actually grew up wanting to be the next Condoleezza Rice. Like, that was like my dream aspiration. Career took a totally different pivot because we talked about in a previous episode, politics kind of broke my heart at an early age because of just how many misogynistic men I dealt with in my early 20s. And, I thought, okay, work in corporate America, it'll be better. They're everywhere. But yeah, no, it is really important because even now, as we are bringing on people who are in the political sphere to the show and trying to elevate women's voices more, it's because like I don't want other young women who aspire to be the next Condi, the next Angela Merkel, the next whoever, to feel like I did in my early 20s. And even now, like thinking back on that, I'm like, oh, why did I give up? Like,
yeah,
we'll circle back on that at some point in life. But yeah, anyway, Demetrius, going back to the broader topic at hand, Dama alluded to several global conflicts happening now, and they are serious and they could have massive repercussions. So like maybe we start with Russia, Ukraine. Could you talk about what's going on in that big corner of the globe?
Yeah, I mean, again, I think this is all goes back to a bit what I said before about sort of like teenage hormones. I think Russia has been struggling as a country. And as the world has been changing around it, you have someone in power there who doesn't want things to change and who wants to go back to the glory days of the past. And there's a deep feeling, whether or not we agree or disagree, I think it's legitimate on the part of, many in Russia that Ukraine is part of Russia. And this has been an animating factor for Russia trying to reassert itself, or for Putin. I don't want to sort of cast aspersions on the whole Russian population, but for President Putin to try to, make Russia important again by launching a war on a country who wants to go in a completely different direction from the direction that he's taking Russia. And that's not, for him, that's not sustainable, because if Ukraine succeeds, then this whole illusion that he's created about Russia goes out the window, and he has a real problem on his hands with his own population. And so, here we are in a place 3 years later after an invasion. We're in somewhat of a stalemate where what direction is this going to go in? And you look at Ukraine, it just breaks my heart on a daily basis that a country who has made its aspirations to go in a particular direction has to face the consequences of being invaded by a neighbor because it wanted to join the European, direction of travel. And here we are in the same place, however many years later, without a clear exit in sight. And you had a very naive president of ours who thought he was going to walk in and solve this thing within
day one,
24 hours. And here we are, how many months later, and it looks like he's actually realizing the complexities of this now, and that the fault doesn't lie at the feet of the Ukrainians, but lies at the feet of a government that is hell-bent on, violating the territorial integrity of a sovereign, independent nation.
I was so tickled, honestly, when you heard how Trump was telling Melania, oh, we had a great conversation. And she goes, really? They just bombed another city. It's like, okay, if your wife is trying to get through to you at this point.
If Melania Trump is giving you the download, that's like,
yeah.
But
I also just want to I want to say this is such a difficult issue to distill. And I think, Demetrios, you said maybe 4 or 5 words in a row that were so articulate to describe it, but each of them is still multi-syllabic, right? Like the territorial integrity of a sovereign nation, right? Breaking that down, I think, for just the general public to even understand, okay, so what does that even mean? Why is it a big deal? I feel like we don't necessarily have the social context for what that even means, right?
So, Sam, I think it's a great question. And like, there's so many incredible things that happened post World War II. One of which is you don't invade another country just because. Like, that was what people did back in the old days. You settled scores. You're like, oh, I'm just going to invade you and take a little part of your country. And we lived in a very stable world after 1945, where that was just unheard of. And here you go, in whatever year, 2023, where that just stopped.
Like one February morning, it just...
Yeah. It was February 2022. I remember because I had just been in New York
2022,
City.
yeah.
And I remember reading, like, watching the headlines come through and thinking, oh my God, we're here again as a world? How? And, you know, like, yeah, going back to the hormones, it's like, to me, I'm like, it's like teenagers or toddlers who can't learn to play nice.
Mm-hmm.
They're toys. You can have your toys too, but like, go play with them over there.
Right. And we play a role in that as well, right? Because we have a president who just sort of off the cuff suggests that we're going to procure other countries like they're just companies that are, you know, are bad ledgers to be.
Right. I mean,
just,
it's like, oh, you know, he treats it like he's just buying another house for himself. You know?
Well, and it's not, I mean, not that Greenland doesn't deserve their own autonomy and sovereign status, but like Canada, like the idea that we could just...
Greenland.
Greenland. Yeah, sorry. The idea that we could just annex Canada, which is a commonwealth of a completely other nation and a partner of ours. Like, it's just...
Right.
Right. And you have all of these sort of like men, especially on the internet, that are like, what a great idea. Let's just go get it. And I'm like, well, there's a consent piece missing here. Like, Canada doesn't want to be part of the United States.
Well, they can't. They can't. Even if they wanted to, they'd have to go through 5 steps before they could even do that. I mean, wild. So let's talk a little bit about Israel and Gaza and the Middle East, because that is another, you know, like, it's like these men, man. They just like, and I think this one, I want to, like, you know, caveat it by, we all very much believe that Israel has the right to exist and be safe, right? That is not, I don't think that's in question. But if you say that, I think you also then have to talk about the people in Gaza who have been basically herded into a pretty small area at this point. And, you know, the conversation about how many people have been killed and have been affected by the last few years post the October attack. You know, I've heard people on one side and, you know, Jewish people say they don't necessarily trust the numbers that are coming out about the number of people affected or killed, but whatever, the suffering is real there. And that is something that kind of threatens to spill out over into the entire Middle East, right? So can you talk a little bit about, after World War II, how we got Israel and what happened with the people there and the idea of these settlements? Because even I, as somebody who has a degree in political science, I didn't understand about the settlements and about the like refugees until I went there. And of course it made sense to understand, oh, these areas are completely built up. These people that they're saying it's refugees or settlements, there's skyscrapers there. Like, of course, because they've been there since, you know, the 50s, right? And so the idea that the people, the Palestinians who are living there, are like living in refugee camps is not really accurate, right? These are people who had whole cities, and that's really what we're seeing destroyed when we look at Gaza. So I think it would be just to get a little bit of history about how we got Israel, where that area came from, you know, who was there already, would be helpful for our listeners.
So I'm caveating all of this. I am not a Middle East expert. You know, I watch it with a great amount of interest, especially now, sort of thinking about how this is all going to kind of play out in the future. But, you know, the area has always been at the crossroads of many civilizations, you know, many religions, and it's been somewhat of a powder keg, you know, over the course of the years. And, you know, Netanyahu found himself in a situation where his political survival relied on very, very ultra right-wing nationalists who had a very maybe different view of the way that Israel and the Palestinian population should sort of live and get along or just coexist.
Coexist, yeah.
So we find ourselves in a horrible situation where, the Hamas, I think, took advantage of the political situation in Israel, launched the atrocity on October 8th, knowing that, Israel was probably going to respond in the way that it did. And here we are, years later in a world that was probably unimaginable before October 8th, in that you have a Palestinian population that's been sort of, as you said, moved to a hardly any land whatsoever. Who knows what Gaza is going to look like? But then you have, the Iranian proxies of Hezbollah that have been so completely weakened that enabled Israel to be able to strike Iran. And again, we're in this extremely volatile period right now where the Middle East is going to look different from probably what we've known in terms of configuration of alliances, but it's unclear how that's gonna play out.
Mm-hmm.
Will this lead to a rapprochement between Israel and Saudi Arabia? It's hard to imagine, but that's clearly something that's in the cards. Where does the new Syria, fit into this whole equation? And then the question that no one has been able to resolve is what is going to happen to the Palestinian population and to their aspirations of nationhood? Will that actually be an essential component to any settlement between Israel and Saudi Arabia? Will Israel have to agree to a normalization of status for the Palestinians in a homeland that is their own as a price to have full normalization in the Gulf? I have no idea. These are fascinating questions, and I don't know enough to even give a prediction. But here we are, just as we are with Russia and Ukraine. It's extraordinarily volatile in the Middle East and adds a whole new layer of geopolitical risk that really wasn't there, 3 years ago.
Yeah. And so can you then talk about how that kind of translates to us? Because then after all of these things, we see a lot of things. And I mean, Europe is seeing it already, right? With energy prices because of the Russia component, right? We're also starting to see it. There's, the refugee crisis, but then we're also seeing rising anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. There's a lot of conversation about defense spending. Like one of the craziest things I ever saw yesterday, Marjorie Taylor Greene, she puts up an amendment that basically would have pulled $500 million, I think, from Russia, from funds that were going to Israel for defense spending for them, right? And it would have pulled them, right? Because she said, and literally her rationale for it was we don't spend enough on education here in the U.S. We don't have free health care.
Marjorie Taylor Greene.
Oh, it's a horseshoe, right? It's these parties. It's a horseshoe. It's the one end is here, the other end is here, right? And who voted with her? Very few people voted with her. It went down, but I think it was 9 people voted with her. But who voted with her? Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, people who she actually has personal beef with, and they have personal beef with her, right? And there's a number of people, obviously, a lot of Democrats didn't vote for it for many different reasons. It just wasn't really going anywhere. But you're starting to see things like that, right? It's really spilling over here. And then also, of course, you have wild things we apparently bombed Iran. Maybe we obliterated it. The nuclear capabilities, maybe we didn't, as it turns out, maybe not. But these things are starting to impact us here. And when we have diplomats who are out doing various things and working and, in the field and in missions around the world, how does that impact them? Because we're seeing it here. How does that impact the U.S. as we're out trying to just be the U.S. in other countries?
It makes it hard for diplomats in the sense that, if you don't really know what the policy is, it's hard to be able to, sort of explain it to, your counterparts in the host, whatever country you're in. And it's also hard to be able to navigate because when things, again, it's as we talked about in the last episode with trade, when there's uncertainty, it's very hard to know how to navigate it. When if you don't have sort of clear, if you don't have clarity, if you don't have clear guidance, if you don't have a clear policy, it's very hard to be a diplomat because your role is to really sort of help explain and troubleshoot and kind of smooth out what or communicate what the U.S. position is on a particular issue, and try to maybe help that country see the way the U.S. is seeing it. But when things are changing so rapidly and when policies shift so quickly, it makes life very difficult for a diplomat because you're sort of left not really sure what you're supposed to do and how you're supposed to do it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that, you're getting a lot of questions. I mean, if you're in a mission somewhere, you're probably getting a lot of questions from folks on the ground, like what is actually going on in the U.S. and to your point, the consistency, like and what's next? Like what is actually next? And so I think that's something that is really wild to me because as I sit here, I'm not a diplomat, but I wonder what is next, right? I mean, when we had like the few days that were leading up to the Iran strike and it became, the president was like, maybe I do something in 2 weeks and you hear about fighter jets. I mean, living in New York, we were kind of like, we're in the line of fire. You know what I mean? If there's ICBMs flying somewhere, they're not hitting California. They're coming here to the Eastern Seaboard, right? If we get into some kind of something that we can't get out of. And so it definitely feels like this is hitting us. And so I guess the next question then is peace still possible in your mind? I mean, with this administration or kind of ever again, because I think one of the things that we've been talking quite a bit about is, again, the uncertainty, the inconsistency. Even if we did have, say we had Obama 2.0, right? Say we had a George Bush 2.0, where we went back to some kind of president that looked more like the rational actors that we've seen in the past, where you kind of knew what the expected outcomes would be. Do we get trust back from our partners? I mean, what?
I think the answer to that, unfortunately, is no. I think once you shatter trust, it's very hard to rebuild quickly. Maybe that's something that will happen over a longer term. But look, if you put yourself in the shoes of one of our, allies, let's just start with allies and not with, countries with whom we may have sort of an adversarial relationship with. Let's say you're Canada, or let's say you're, the East, one of the EU countries. The entity that you relied on and that was actually a source of consistency for so many years no longer is acting in that capacity. All of a sudden you realize, even if the next president is, whether, she or he is a Republican or a Democrat, they could be the most rational, best on the global stage that we've ever seen. There's always going to be that little voice in the back of your mind that says, yeah, that's great, but we've seen what can happen in the next election. There could be someone that comes in who's unpredictable. The U.S. has never had an unpredictable president. You could fault all of the presidents for things. Unpredictability is not one of them. Certainly if you're an ally, if you're Japan, the EU, or Canada, that you're going to be able to count on the United States through thick and thin. That's kind of been shattered right now. And maybe, for 4 years, there's like a sense of normalcy, or 8 years. But if you're a foreign country, you know that this can come back at any point. And I think that's going to make it very difficult for a country to actually stake its future in the future of the United States. And as somebody who worked in the U.S. government, who is so proud of my service in the U.S. government, that breaks my heart to even think that, let alone say it.
Right. We're kind of like a bad boyfriend, right? Like we already broke up. We sold the house. We moved out. I packed the boxes. Now you want to like get back together? I don't trust you. Right. I mean, there's too much tearing apart and setting up separately to even think about that.
Sam, I was going to give the same exact analogy. Same wavelength, because, you know, I've gone back to a bad boyfriend in the past too. And you're like, oh yeah, no, you don't change actually. So we moved on. Demetrius, something that I've been thinking about as we've been talking about all these conflicts and the, very precarious position we're now in as a country is how susceptible people are to misinformation due to social media and all these new digital channels.
AI.
And like AI generated content, because there are people who are saying that the pictures and videos that we're seeing of Gaza are AI generated. Like a lot of people do believe that those are fake. But who's to say that there couldn't be a nefarious actor who at some point is creating AI generated content to try to sway a population, right? And that was something in the wake of October 7th, actually, that was really like, I think we saw how dangerous social media is in the days leading after the attack, because of how many influencers and polarizing actors on both sides flooded our channels with content that was pushing whatever agenda they were trying to push, right? So I'm curious for your thoughts, Demetrius, on the role of social media and technology within all these geopolitical conflicts, and kind of any maybe cautions or concerns you have.
Lots of caution and lots of concern. And it's like the same thing with our domestic political system. There's no single source of truth anymore. And, people can cherry pick whatever image that they see, on their social media feed as truth. And, how do you police that? You don't. There's no way really of policing it. It's trying to sort of provide the population with enough education, so that they're able to distinguish between, what's fake and what's not. And Adama, as you said, with the rise of AI, it just makes that even harder. It makes it harder from a visual perspective. It makes it harder from a sound perspective to actually know what's true and what's not true. And so, we have a polarized, we approach, foreign policy was never polarized in the United States. It just wasn't. It was, we approached the world with one voice, whether it was we were a Democratic president or Republican president, it was the United States. Now, again, you don't know what you're going to get if, depending on what voice on social media is actually having the most influence on a particular, president or presidential candidate or senator or whatnot. And it makes it, again, as a diplomat, as a foreign country, it makes it very difficult to know how to deal with the United States, because there's just so many different sources that are coming at each individual, and no one really knows what the truth is anymore. And it's really, it's scary.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Yeah. It's terrifying to think that, an entire generation too, they haven't grown up in a world where you didn't have social media or like constant access to information. And so the priming and the brainwashing that can occur from a very young age is very real now.
Yeah, and I think we look at the Russia situation, as a really good example of this, where I think during the Biden administration, folks that are currently in power may have had a very different view of the conflict in Ukraine and the invasion in Ukraine than they do now, when they're actually dealing with the actual facts and are actually having to negotiate with Putin. I think the Russians did a very good job at manipulating content, so that, people in the United States, or, certainly people who were, favored the initial position of the Trump administration on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. I think now the president sees very clearly what the issue is, because he's having to actually confront with the facts on the ground, rather than the facts as presented through, manipulated content.
I mean, looking at that first meeting with Zelensky that went so sideways, to seeing him back at the White House with very little fanfare, I think this past week or the week before, walking with Trump, clearly having some kind of, conversation. I don't know where the meeting actually took place, but you saw the two of them walking and talking, and there was no more of this popping off about you need to be grateful or have you even said thank you, you know? So it does feel like there's been progress. I mean, like, I don't know why it had to take so long. I don't know why he was like the last guy to realize it, like whatever else is going on. But it does feel like there has been movement, at least in the last few months on that, but at the expense of what, right? At the expense of how many lives, how much time? I mean, and
Well, and from a foreign policy perspective, to your point, Adama, there was so much fanfare on embarrassing President Zelensky on a national stage, and the commensurate amount of energy was not put into, calming things down, normalizing, making it right. And so I think, Demetrios, to your points earlier, and our kind of like Maddie and I both thinking of the bad boyfriend concept, right? Like, well, he's not punching me in the face today, but he didn't exactly make it up to me, right? And I think that breeds so much distrust when other countries look at us of, and I don't know which side of you I'm going to get on any given day. And I do know if you embarrass me, you're not going to make it up to me
right,
in public.
right. And then, if you're Zelensky, if the US is willing to play ball, what choice do you have? Like, you got to come back hat in hand, more or less, right? And continue to ask for aid, continue to ask for support, continue to, encourage sanctions on the aggressor. What role do you have? And I don't know. Again, I feel like if there were more women in this, like, maybe we wouldn't have so many of these just situations that just feel really intractable. So I'd love it if you...
More women, though, like, why do we believe not more women are in roles up to like diplomatic,
like in Russia or here in the US or in general?
Maybe start in general, and then of course I think we all kind of know why in the US that's the case. But like, I'm curious, given you've worked with so many different governments around the world, and dignitaries, like, did you find that there were more women in these kinds of positions in the other countries that you were interacting with? Did you find that it was the same? And just kind of curious about your thoughts on that.
It's interesting. In my experience, so many of my counterparts and particularly on the trade side were women, and including on the U.S. side. I mean, the strongest and most fierce and most effective trade negotiators that I worked with were all women, and the Council on Foreign Relations has a program that's it's not a trade one. It's more on the foreign policy side. But since we're talking about foreign policy, it's their Women in Foreign Policy program, and they have a blog, that's called Women Around the World, and it's basically, it's a reminder of the strong and powerful and effective women that are in leadership roles on the foreign stage. And again, it's a reminder, to everybody that, as we think of like, being in a male dominated world, that there is a very strong, effective, and very real presence of unbelievable women diplomats, unbelievable women trade negotiators that are models for the future generation. And I think that's why the Council on Foreign Relations has really set up such a strong Women in Foreign Policy program, is to remind us all, and to remind again the future generation, that women need to be at the table. They need to be the ones negotiating trade agreements. They need to be the ones who are involved in national security. They need to be the ones who are, at the State Department or the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in pick your country, running the central banks of pick your country. There are a lot of examples out there that, and it's easy to forget and, kind of gloss over.
Mm-hmm.
But
and we do not want to erase women who are doing good work at all. Can you talk about the Council on Foreign Relations?
The Council on Foreign Relations is an older organization. It's older in that it's been in existence for a long time, and it's really a great foreign policy think tank. And it's now, their new president as of a few years ago is somebody that I worked very closely in the Obama administration, Mike Froman. And he's, has worked really hard to make the Council on Foreign Relations more relevant to today's generation, and not just, an organization that produces unbelievable thought leadership, but an organization that is also kind of relevant to the foreign policy challenges that, we're talking about on this call, on this podcast, or, that a younger generation is trying to kind of grapple with, where do they fit into this? And I think it's a member driven organization, but I do think it's developed a real niche place in the foreign policy space. And I actually would encourage folks to check out their website and check out their publications, because they're very good and it's very thoughtful.
If we have any listeners who are thinking about a career in foreign service or, with the diplomatic corps, do you have any advice for them? Like, it would be, to me, it would be incredibly daunting at this moment to think like, wow, maybe I want to go into foreign service, right? Because what does that even look like? And it feels like the sands are just shifting so quickly from one administration to the next. I mean,
do it is what I would say. Do it. It's the sands are shifting. The sands are going to shift back. I mean, it is an unbelievable privilege to say, hi, my name is so-and-so, and I, am here on behalf of the United States of America. It is it really is an unbelievable privilege and an opportunity. And it's something that you can do as a young person. You can really develop a career as, some really smart economic policymaker that's working in Germany, that's working in South Korea, that's working in Australia, and that's actually advancing the ball. It's very easy to be cynical right now. I find myself in a somewhat cynical place, which is very unlike me because I'm by nature an optimistic person. But we have to all take ourselves out of like the day-to-day like outrages that we face and think, if we're going to contribute, particularly if you're a young person, complaining is not the way to do it. You got to do something. And if you're a young 22-year-old and you have an interest in the world, you have an interest in policymaking, scratch that itch, do it now, because you don't want to be one of those armchair people that it's like, oh, I know something about foreign policy, and if it only I had done this 30 years ago. Well, do it now so that you don't have to say that. And it is, I mean, I've been very lucky in my career, like both in the private sector and the public sector, but my gosh, the things I was able to do as a representative of the United States of America is pretty damn cool. And for any young person, do it.
Give us a highlight. Give us something that you worked on that, you still think about, that you're proud of.
At risk of repeating myself, because for those of you who tuned into the last episode, you've already heard this. But really, I think the most proud moment of mine was I don't remember what year it was. It was like maybe 2010. I was in Liberia, post-conflict, and we were giving the Liberians the ability to export their products duty-free into the United States, their apparel products. And I walked into a factory of about 70 women who got up and sang a song of thanks to me and to the United States for giving them the opportunity, them who had no husbands because they were all killed during the civil conflict, these women who had children that they needed to put through school, the fact that we were giving them the ability to make products and sell them to Prana, who was selling them, in your local store. I cried. And I think about it and I get teary. I was so proud that I could give this on behalf of the United States, these women the opportunity to actually have a livelihood and provide for their children in a way that they wouldn't have been able to do otherwise. I mean, that's what it is working for the government. You can do something that actually if you can help one person, you've succeeded in your job.
It's amazing. I have chills just hearing that. It's amazing. I love it.
Me curious, what about, you were talking about people who are just starting their careers, are young and are, interested in foreign service. What about like people around the country who might be whatever age and are wanting to get into politics and make an impact? Do you have any advice for those people who are like, okay, I'm fed up, but I'm not going to just sit here and complain. I want to do something.
There's so many ways. I mean, as you guys know, there's so many ways to contribute. I mean, from, marching, writing an article, writing a letter to your member of Congress, going to your member of Congress's town hall, getting involved in politics, going door to door. Like, it matters. It really matters. And again, if you only convince one person to vote in a certain way, you're making an impact. And it's easy for everybody just to be like, I can't do it. It's too hard. There are too many people to influence. If all you need is one, and if you could do one, you've done something.
Yeah. And I mean, you've worked with members of Congress. I mean, what constituent feedback means to members of Congress, right? I mean, I think we always say that like, you got to reach out, call your member, but that does matter, especially when you call up and you're like, look, this is my zip code. I am in your district. I need you to vote no, or I need you to vote yes, or I need you to advocate for this, or I need you to fund this program. Those things do matter to elected officials. And I think we can also say, like, we want you to make sure that the U.S. is putting its best foot forward. And, we shouldn't be burning barns full of food because we just cut the funding and now don't have the supply chain to distribute it, right? Like, what a horrendous thing to do. And what a harm. We've talked some about USAID and, the benefits of programs like that around the world, because to me, that goes kind of hand in hand with the mission that you had at USTR, right? About improving our status abroad, winning hearts and minds, right? That's another form of diplomacy, USAID, and we're walking that back, So it does feel like that kind of cuts the knees out of diplomats, right? When they used to be able to point to and rely on all of these things that the U.S. was doing as they are out there talking to their counterparts. And now we're not doing those things anymore. And it takes away some of the leverage and the impact that we had, and that the diplomatic corps has, and that the trade corps has.
100%. However, this is the counter. And the counter is it is tragic that what's happened to USAID. We've done a shitty job explaining why foreign assistance is important and why foreign assistance is in the interest of you and me and everybody in the United States. It is, but people think that giving money to someone in another country is throwing money away. It's not.
Yeah.
It's not. It's winning hearts and minds. It's furthering U.S. policy. It's preventing a refugee crisis that would make the situation here worse. We just never explain it. And so the fact that a majority of Americans think foreign assistance is a waste is our own fault. And we need to actually make that argument as to why refunding, having a strong and robust USAID is in the interests of the American taxpayer.
Mm-hmm.
Is there anybody out there, any organization, Demetrius, that you think is doing a good job of like explaining complex? Wow.
No. And I think part of it, and that's a kind of like a shooting at the hip answer. I think there are a lot of organizations that try.
Yeah.
And I think everyone is now suffering from such whiplash now with what's happened to USAID, that the development community, it just doesn't even know what to do anymore, because they've been kind of not legislated, they've been executived out of existence. But yeah, there needs to now be a groundswell of, from a policy perspective, of explanations as to why this matters and why we need to do it again and why we need to get back in the game. Yeah, there probably was fat at USAID. Clearly, there is, as there is in any government agency. But rationalizing that is something very different from completely eliminating it and eliminating our effectiveness as a country in other markets. But we need to do a better job of explaining why that's important.
I think that's so true. And Adama, I can't remember if we talked about this offline or if it came up on one of the Sunday streams, but even just articulating the need for it in the vein of people's own political self-interest, right? If you sort of look where the narrative is nationally, online, and otherwise, people are very worried about refugees coming into the country and any number of other things. And the way that you prevent that, or you prevent unrest, is you make sure that people are able to live and belong in their country and are supported and are part of a functional trade network, and national security and international security are all stable. When you sort of let that all go to hell, you end up with a lot of instability that does come and impact us. And I think that people do care about that. They just don't connect A to Z.
Yeah.
Amen.
Connecting of the dots has been a recurring theme in this conversation. And,
It has been.
try to do that on this show, but how successful, I don't know, listeners. Hey, drop a rating.
One more question, just on that. Sorry, I have so much. I could talk to Demetrius for a lot of time, a lot of hours. I know you have to stay informed. What news outlets do you look at? How do you stay informed in the morning when you're let me figure out what's going on in the world? How do you stay informed? What do you look at? What do you read?
I read not everything. I read a lot of things in the morning. I'll tell you what I think is the best source for international economic, international foreign policy issues is your weekly edition of The Economist. I honestly cannot. It distills things, and it focuses not just on what's hot. It focuses on issues that matter all around the world, and I learn so much from my little edition that comes out either on Friday or Saturday, whenever it gets delivered to me. I think that's, to me, the best source. It's objective. It's not political. It's not partisan. It just tells it like it is, and you can agree or disagree. And I think they do a very good job also presenting both sides of an argument. And then they have their view, which is good because you want to have a view. But I do think that's the best source on these types of topics. I think it's the best source for public consumption.
I'm going to re-up my Economist subscription after this. I used to read that every week. You, Demetrius, that was my Sunday morning ritual. So yeah.
And I don't think we focus enough or talk enough about how important long form journalism is anymore. I think people are so addicted to the breaking news and just getting, reels. And there are some topics that should not be reduced to 300 words, right? Sometimes you need couple thousand words to really dig into a meaty topic. We needed an hour, right? We wanted an hour to really talk through this because some of these topics, they deserve an amount of respect and pulling apart that you just don't have in 15 minutes. So, well, thank you. As we come to a close on 2 episodes with you, thank you so much for your time. We are incredibly, incredibly grateful to have your expertise and your generosity. We really, really appreciate you. Any words you want to leave our listeners with or anything you want to say? Really appreciate your time.
I'm so appreciative of being here. And I think my last word is, we can't give up hope. Your show is all about empowerment. We need to be empowered to know that there is a future and that we can shape it. So I love what you guys are doing and keep doing it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Well, thank you everybody for tuning in and listening. Feel free to send in questions. Let us know thoughts, ideas, suggestions. We are always open. We always want to hear from our listeners. Everybody have a great week. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.